Yes. Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will take place on January 25th, when Kathy Curtis will talk about her new biography of Elizabeth Hardwick. She will be in conversation with Ian Baruma, the former editor of the New York Review of Books. Please mark your calendars and register for this event on the Leon Levy website. And please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. And note that this, like all our programs, will be recorded and posted on our website too. But tonight, I am delighted to introduce the astute and very prolific Julian Zelizer, who will be talking about his new biography of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He will be in conversation with the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Blight. Julian Zelizer is a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University and a CNN political analyst and a regular guest on NPR's Here and Now. He is the author and editor of 22 books, including most recently Burning Down the House, Newt Gingrich, The Fall of a Speaker, and the Rise of the New Republican Party, published by Penguin Press. In 2021-22, in the next year, he will publish 3 new edited volumes. Daniel Bell, Defining the Age, Daniel Bell, His Time and Ours, co-edited with Paul Starr. Another book, The Presidency of Donald J. Trump, a first historical assessment, published by Princeton University Press. And finally, yet another book, Myth America. Historians take on the biggest lies and legends about our past, published by Basic Books and co-edited with Kevin Cruz. He is currently working also on a new book about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the 1964 Democratic Convention. David W. Blight is the Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. Previously, Blight was a professor of history at Amherst College, where he taught for 13 years. Blight is the author of Battlefield, Race, Memory, and the American Civil War, among many other works. He has won several awards, including the Bancroft Prize and Frederick Douglass Prize for Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory, and the Pulitzer Prize and Lincoln Prize for Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. Please look for these books and others at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Zelizer and Blight will be in conversation now for about 40-45 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the chat box below to type in your questions, and David will be sure to get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. And now
here's the main speaker right here.
Ben Carneal.
And now I turn this conversation over to David Blight. Thank you, David.
Okay, where's David? Here's David.
Thank you, Kai. There was some interruption there.
No kidding.
Well,
Ben Carnell, you need to mute yourself.
Yeah, I think everybody needs to mute. Thad is trying to mute everybody, but
there we go. He's now muted.
Okay.
So go ahead, David.
All right, here we go. Julian, first of all, Kai, thank you. And Julian, thank you for inviting me to do this event with you. I was honored, in fact, thrilled, astonished. I became myself very interested in Abraham Heschel when writing my Frederick Douglass book. So you must have picked that up. But let's get right after this. Julian, you've written many books on modern American politics. You've written on the presidency. You've written on the media. You've written on political process. In fact, you are the engine of the revival of American political history. But here you are taking on this great Jewish theologian. And I obviously know from reading this, and others may know, this is a very personal book for you, I think. And I'd like to hear you discuss that a bit. You are yourself the son and grandson of rabbis, and your father and grandfather had their own connections to Rabbi Heschel. Would you talk a bit about that to get us started?
Of course, and thanks to Kai and Thad for putting this all together, and of course to you, David, for agreeing to participate. I finally found a way we could be on an event together, since you're one of my favorite historians. And look, there was two reasons I took the opportunity to write this, and one is personal. As historians, sometimes you find a theme that is not just of interest to you, but that connects to the most personal parts of your life. And I come from a family of rabbis. Both my grandfather and my father were products of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the seminary for conservative Judaism, which is where Heschel taught. My father took a class with Heschel. Their lives intersected that way. My grandfather, who was a rabbi in Columbus, was of that generation of rabbis, and I'm a I think sorry, it's the Zoom era, and finally, I am a religious conservative Jew, so I've been aware of Heschel growing up. I was aware of him as an adult. I see and read his quotes during services. The iconic picture at Selma is something seen many times, even though I didn't think I would write about it. So when you get the opportunity like this to delve into a key element of your life, and through a figure who's loomed there outside the classroom, it was just a wonderful opportunity to do it. And it was a way as to bring the tools I have to think also not just about him, but about American Judaism. And the tools I mean are, I am not a historian of American Jewish history. I'm an American historian. And so to contextualize what he was doing, the debates he was having, and ultimately the political elements of his career in the last decade was just something I couldn't resist. And it really was quite fulfilling, to be honest, as a writer, to have the chance to do this.
Well, I could feel that in your prose. There's no question about that. Let's, if you don't mind, be good historians for a little while and take Heschel through his life, particularly for those in the audience who may not know that much about Heschel. He's born in 1907 in Warsaw. He is himself born into what I think you called a rabbinic dynasty. As a child, he's reading rabbinical commentaries. He's reading Torah as a child, but he's in this center, in many ways, of world Judaism in Warsaw. Huge Jewish population, many synagogues, and he grows up in Hasidic Judaism. Talk about his youth, if you would. He is a prodigy, to say the least. But tell us who he is and where he's from, and then we can take him to Berlin and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, so each chapter of the book, for those who will pick it up, it's organized around a place that was important at that moment. And so the first chapter in his life, and the place for him is Warsaw, where he's born and where he lives in a pretty religious, traditional community. He is a Hasidic Jew. His father is a rabbi and a very well-respected and well-loved person. And he grows up, it's an interesting city. On the one hand, he's growing up in this very insular community where most of his day is spent learning Torah and Jewish law and stories from Hasidic lore of the Baal Shem Tov and how humans are capable of great kindness and how individuals could raise themselves spiritually. But it's also a city that's bubbling with lots of other stuff. Within Judaism, there's a lot of poets and writers. There are labor radicals. There are kind of early Zionists, all in the same areas where he's living. And what's fascinating about him as a youth, growing up through his father's death in 1916 during the influenza epidemic, through the moment he'll decide ultimately to leave this city, is how he's a kid who's very smart, but interested in these different worlds, including very secular Yiddish writers and poets who are attractive to him, who he starts to intersect with. And that's the world he comes from. And at one moment, in the end, he decides he doesn't want to stay there, which is a big decision. But he's being trained to be a Rebbe, to be a religious leader throughout this period.
Yeah, and right away, one of the biggest themes of your book and the biggest themes of Heschel's life comes to the fore, and that is the struggle between sacred tradition, deep faith, and practice, and the modern world, the world of secular modernity, the world of science, the world of ideas. He's already experiencing that as a child. In fact, I love that moment where you talk about how his mother was so fearful of him leaving to go to that high school, and so on, because, oh my God, he was going to, lose the faith. But that's a theme of his life. The rest of it, isn't it?
It is. And he meets, I found one of the stories that's so interesting is his uncle is also a rabbi who, after his dad dies, will train him. And on the Sabbath, at the end of the day, he had these famous meals where lots of people would come, and his uncle could speak about almost anything, without any kind of notes, just off the top of his head in brilliant ways. But all kinds of interesting people would come to this dinner, to this meal, and Heschel would be there as a kid. He'd sit right next to his uncle, but that included psychologists who were working at the university, and this intellectual world, which was instantly attractive. And so that tension that you're talking about, I didn't expect it, but it was right there during his youth, even though in some ways he's growing up in what you would think was just a totally insular world.
And he goes off to high school in Vilna, right? And then where he again is, he's lonely, but he's thriving. He's again a prodigy. But now he's going to go to what was arguably the greatest university in the world at that time, Berlin, in about 1920, or no, a little later. He gets ordained as a rabbi when he's only 16, but he's now going to venture all the way to Berlin and go to university and major in philosophy. Talk a bit about that, because this is a huge turning point in his intellectual life, isn't it? He begins to mix Judaism with world philosophy, and he has all kinds of interesting teachers. But if anything, in fact, what I found so fascinating, it goes on through the book, is that whatever he encounters in terms of modernity and the secular world, and for that matter, evil and horror, it seems to only increase his piety. So
that's talk
about Berlin, because that's a big turning point in his life.
So he decides at a certain point, which was a big decision, to leave, and he goes to this school in Vilna, where basically that was the only way he was going to go to university, to receive his secular education. And he goes to Berlin, and he's there as the Nazis are rising to power. He's a student at the University of Berlin, where he's studying, and he'll study for his doctorate in philosophy, learning and interacting with some of the most exciting intellectuals in the world at the time. And that ranged from what he was doing in the classroom to salons, essentially, that he was attending in people's homes. And he very much enmeshes himself in these intellectual circles of the city. Some, like Martin Buber, are fascinated with him because here there's this guy who comes from this very authentic Hasidic background in Eastern Europe. And it's a moment in the 1930s where more German Jewish intellectuals, rather than distancing themselves from this, are trying to understand it and almost inspired by it, sometimes in a very romantic way. But he's the perfect figure. And these years are great intellectually. He is continuing to see both the connections and the tensions between what he has learned and how he is thinking of philosophical questions and more secular colleagues, such as he believes in God. It's not a metaphor for something. It's not a symbol of something. And many of his colleagues don't. And these are years where I think he emerges professionally, not just intellectually. He'll finish his dissertation. He struggles to get it published, but he ultimately does. And he ends up teaching in institute in Frankfurt, where it's a Jewish adult education program until 1938, when the Gestapo rounds up Jews who are living in the country and kicks many of them out who weren't from there. And he's one of those people.
You know, you use a passage from him there. I think that's where you used it, where he says, I mean, he loved his philosophy classes and so on and so forth. And he's reading world philosophy here. But he says, all these philosophers I read, they all want to study what is the good. I wanted to know what was holy. I mean, I love that passage because that tells us a lot about Heschel. And he sort of never stopped doing that, whatever he encounters. He also becomes a poet, right? A really ambitious poet. Starts publishing poetry all over the place. In fact, he was even doing that when he was a high school kid, wasn't he?
Yeah. No, he was writing poetry. Back in Warsaw, he writes poetry for this journal of these very secular Yiddish writers. And that's when he starts. And in Germany, he even does one under a pseudonym where he's blasting what he's seen from the Nazis in terms of their treatment of the Jews. And so poetry, which will ultimately become a little bit of how he writes, is quite important to how he thinks.
Oh, he writes, well, prose poetry. I mean, it's, well, we can come back to his style a bit later, perhaps. I love his style. He sometimes writes in these almost fragments that are just, it's a little bit like Emerson. They're just passages you have to quote. But now, of course, the story, of course, gets much darker. He arrives in Berlin in 1927. This is Weimar, Germany. Cultural ferment is almost nowhere else in the world. But by the time he finishes there and is into his dissertation, the Nazis are in power. And you use a phrase, your phrase is, he's racing against time with his work, with his life. This is the 30s. Take us through that, if you would, because this now becomes a horribly tragic story for his family.
Yeah, I mean, he's professionally, literally racing for time. He has to publish his dissertation to get his doctorate, and initially he can't. There's very few Jewish publishers or publishers that will publish the work of Jews. Books by Jews can't be sold in a lot of stores because of Nazi laws. And ultimately, he's able to do it. He scrambles and he's able to make enough money for one publisher who asks for something called a subvention, where you essentially finance it. When he asks for an extension from the dean because he's having trouble with this, the dean signs the letter Heil Hitler. So it's very much on his mind. And then ultimately, when he is literally kicked out and packs his bags, he's living in this little apartment and just takes what he can and ultimately is saved. He's able to get back into Poland. And then we can talk about how he ends up in the United States. He's living with the ferocity of what was happening in Nazi Germany. And it's very much kind of the pace at which he's trying to move up and ultimately get out. And he's horrified. He's very angry by 38, in part with what he's seen from Christian Germans who he believes are not doing enough. And he doesn't understand this. Why aren't they reacting to what is happening? And this will be a theme that will continue throughout his writing and activism.
Oh, indeed. In fact, it's the silence or the indifference in any circumstance that probably animated or bothered him most. It's going to be the same in the 1960s in the United States. Yes, he goes back to Poland. It's the late 30s now. He's not only racing against time, he almost stays too long, right? And he has the great good luck of now people know about him. He's a noted writer. His intellect, his intellect as fame has traveled, and he gets an invitation to come to the U.S. to a Cincinnati seminary. Without that, I don't suppose we'd be talking much about him, would we? But if you don't mind, tell that story, how Heschel actually gets out of Poland, and then what happened to so much of his family, if you want to.
So an important figure is Julian Morgenstern, who some people might have heard of, many probably didn't. He was the head of the Hebrew Union College, which was the seminary in Cincinnati, which was the center really for Reform Judaism, which in the United States had been growing. And this was where rabbis were being trained for a strand of Judaism that was the least observant of the different denominations that were taking hold by the middle or by the 1930s here in the United States. And Morgenstern is trying to save as many Jewish intellectuals in Eastern Europe as he can. He has these fellowships he gets money for, where he brings them over and they can study here and have food and lodging. And Heschel, through contacts, including Martin Buber and some others who tell Morgenstern about this guy, he's able to get over here. It's not easy. It takes a lot of time to get a visa. He goes to London to live with a brother.
He spends a year in London, doesn't he?
He spends a year, and he doesn't know if he's going to get here, even though he has
the U.S. won't give him a visa first.
And in the end, he does. And he comes and he's in Cincinnati for 5 years. And these are incredibly difficult years. In terms of the war, several family members will get killed. 3 sisters and his mother will all die during World War II. One sister during the bombing of Poland. 2 sisters will be sent to concentration camps. And his mother has a heart attack when the Gestapo break in to arrest her. And so he's living by himself here. He's a real outlier at this seminary. Most of the rabbinic students are not very religious. They don't do the traditional observance of keeping kosher, and they don't speak Hebrew.
And he's very frustrated by that, isn't he?
Very frustrated. And
he's an ascetic Jew who's landed in this Reform seminary.
Seminary. No, it's exactly right. And he had been exposed to kind of the trends of Judaism, obviously in Berlin, but being right in the heart of it, it was hard for him. And at the same time, he's following the news. He's mourning the loss of his family. I tell the story that on Fridays before the sun went down, he would turn on his transistor radio, which he couldn't turn on and off during the Sabbath, and he would let it run until Saturday night so that he could hear the news coming out of Europe. And he's very despondent, and he becomes involved in several moments of activism where here in the United States, he's trying to get attention on what's happening to Jews.
Yeah. And he starts going to New York, and pretty soon he's going to move there. I forget the year now, but
45.
45, right at the end of the war. And this, of course, is where he'll spend the rest of his life. And he gets connected to the Jewish Theological Seminary on the Upper West Side, which will be his professional home the rest of his life. Take us into that now, because this now becomes, I mean, the war is a years of horror. Yep. I actually felt in reading that chapter, Julian, that there's so much more to tell there, but you had to keep this story moving. You had to just cut that off and get to the post-war era, because if anything, this is when Heschel becomes even more prolific, book after book after book after book. And I hope we can stop on 2 or 3 of them here. No, Take him to New York now. He also meets Sylvia Strauss, whom he marries.
Exactly. So he meets Sylvia Strauss in Cincinnati. but he
Yeah, that's
won't
right.
marry her until later. He spends his summers in New York. He loves New York. Before 45, he'll get an apartment there. It's the
Mhm.
center of Jewish life, and it will be even more so after the war and the destruction of so many Jewish communities in Europe, and places like Warsaw and Berlin obviously are not going to hold that place. And so he loves New York, and he loves the community that has formed. And the Jewish Theological Seminary is a seminary for conservative Judaism,
Yeah.
although it's really not. It's known as a seminary for traditional Judaism, meaning non-Reformed Judaism. So you have Orthodox professors, you have conservative professors. He moves there in 45. Louis Finkelstein, who's the chancellor, offers him a full-time faculty position. Part of what attracts him is that Heschel's a bit of an oddity. He is this very spiritual person, and he is kind of enmeshed in Hasidic life and the Kabbalah, where most people at the seminary were not like that. They were being influenced by the social sciences, and they were focused on Jewish law. So he thinks this will be inspirational in many ways for rabbinic students and for the seminary itself. So he comes here. He will marry Sylvia Strauss soon after. And he is also, he's much more comfortable in the Jewish Theological Seminary, but he also has tension there. He's not quite on the same page as many of the younger rabbinic students who are coming there. And there are fundamental debates taking place at JTS after the war of what's the best way to save American Judaism? How do you revitalize it after the Holocaust? And he's part of this very heated debate that will unfold over the course of a decade.
Well, in fact, you have some wonderful moments in the book where you talk about these battles in the hallways of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I also loved that scene where sometimes Heschel would just break into his mysticism or his, I don't know, you could call it ecstasy. He would even dance with the Torah. And you talk about how some of these 20-year-old rabbinical students weren't sure what to do with this guy. You know, he comes from a tradition they'd never encountered. But now the story of your book and of his life does become, how does Judaism get salvaged or reborn or remade in the post-war era? And for the next 10 to 15 years, he writes book after book about this, especially his greatest book of all, called The Prophets, but many, many others. And he's really fighting, it seems to me, correct me here, he's fighting against what he sees as the secularized, we'll call it Reformed Judaism, or no Judaism at all, as so many American Jews moved to suburbs. And he must have made some real enemies with some of the kinds of things he wrote and said about American Jews giving up their Judaism.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two ways to think of what is bothering him. One within Judaism, really by the late 40s and early 50s, and he's talking about this openly. He believes that kind of American Judaism, which is growing, institutions are being built all over the country. It's a very vibrant moment, actually. Yeah. But that the focus on institution building, the focus on what a colleague of his, Mordechai Kaplan, was emphasizing, building synagogues that served as a center of social and cultural life, for him, were not filling the spiritual needs and requirements almost of being a pious person. And he'll give a famous talk at one of the rabbinic gatherings of rabbis with Mordechai Kaplan sitting there, where, you know, he's saying that essentially synagogues are a place where prayer is going to die, and that rabbis are great at giving sermons that sound like op-eds in the New York Times, and they're smart, but they're not teaching people how to pray. And this will be not just a kind of intellectual issue for him, but he's training the rabbis. So he's seen these people, he's seen these young American Jews all the time. And this will continue to be an issue for him through the end of his life. There's another issue beyond Judaism. He's wrestling with this question always. And you can find lines in his writing that bring you back to this. How do we understand the place of religion and spirituality in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb and the nuclear bomb. How do we understand what's the place for all of this? And he's not an anti-modernist. He likes the social sciences, and he believes that science is great. But then what are we losing with our total emphasis on that? And those are the kinds of questions which really, I think, frame a lot of his writing.
Oh, indeed. I mean, you don't have to talk about every book here, but he writes that little book called The Sabbath, which is, that fierce argument for practicing the Sabbath. And I think that's about 1951, but it's in the 50s when he becomes so prolific, just book after book after book. It was as though he could not stop writing. I mean, he actually says that. I write and I write. I can't not write. And I love that passage where he said, I write this and I don't quite like it, so I know I got to write again and again and again and again. That's something all of us writers, I think, understand. But he became very popular, didn't he, as a writer? And sometimes that gets him some critics. I mean, at one point, I forget who it was, called him the rabbi for the Christians. I mean, like he's losing his roots or something, which I don't think he did. But he becomes such a popular force with his ferocity. Talk about that a bit, if you would, because he's not an uncontroversial figure.
No, I mean, within the Jewish theological side, he's very controversial. He's not seen as one of the main figures there. He's doing things and writing about things such as theology that most of the rabbis are just not interested anymore. Most of the professors and a lot of the younger rabbis or the students, they're more interested in this Mordecai Kaplan and his writing than they are in Abraham Heschel. And he feels this. He often feels he's kind of slighted. He feels sometimes there's a level of jealousy that some of his work is getting attention. But outside there, he in the 50s, but long before he's an activist, he's gaining a lot of popularity. This book, The Sabbath, which is really a beautiful short text about what is the Sabbath. Right. And it's essentially an argument. The main argument is that the Jewish religion is a religion of time rather than place. And how do you sanctify time? But it's of the genre of other books in that era, which are critical of commerce and the consumer culture of the United States. And here he's connecting a religious tradition to how do you get out of that? He writes God and Man is Not Alone and God in Search of Man, books that are getting reviewed. He's becoming very respected in non-Jewish theological circles. Reinhold Niebuhr teaches a few blocks away, essentially, is a big admirer, and they become close friends. He reviews his book in the New York Herald, and there's a community of religious thinkers in New York City that John Butler wrote about, and they latch on to him, and he's becoming, he's popular on the synagogue circuit. I found this in the archives. By the mid to late 50s, he's just speaking in a lot of places. He's a regular as a weekend scholar in residence. And that book, The Sabbath, is actually used in a national campaign to promote the observance of Sabbath, where synagogues would receive all sorts of things with his text actually being a centerpiece. And so by the end of the 50s, he's a pretty well-known figure. You can find articles about him in Time magazine, Newsweek magazine. And it's it's unusual even today to think back to a period where Paul Tillich is on the cover of I think it was Time magazine, and Heschel's being discussed. It was a pretty
you got me thinking. You got me thinking, and in this, this political crisis over our democracy that we're living through now, where is that cluster today? I mean, you don't have to answer this, but where is that cluster of great religious leaders who can gain this kind of attention and help us through this? I don't know. I mean, they're certainly out there, but it's not like it was back then.
And they weren't. Let me just add one thing. Pre-60s, what's also interesting is they're not particularly political. So they're writing about these issues like Heschel is about what's the relationship between humans and God. How do you be how can you become a more spiritual person?
How can you learn to pray better?
Selling, And they sold, they got attention and sold. So there was space in publishing and
Yeah.
in reading for these kinds of questions, which is I found quite remarkable. And
It is
unlike where we are
fascinating
today.
because today that kind of publishing comes out of Nashville,
Right.
and it tends to be about evangelical Christianity with big audiences. But the kind of progressive traditions or whatever we want to call it that we're talking about here, not so much. Could we talk a moment at least about his truly great, his masterpiece? This is my copy. The Prophets. That's the old dissertation that he revises and updates, gets it out in the 50s, and then I think a major edition was published in 62.
Mhm.
But that book is just an amazing, well, to me, meditation on the Hebrew prophets. That's what it's about. But it's also on the very idea, as his opening chapter says, what manner of man is a prophet? And no one ever wrote about the Hebrew prophets, I think, quite like this. And he virtually made himself into one, but that's for you to judge.
Well, I mean, I think and it's a book that will have a lot of, for him, in the process of revising the dissertation into a book, he would say this is when he became attuned to the civil rights movement and really
That's right.
thought of
That's
his
what
connection.
led him there, right? Yeah.
And civil rights leaders will read this book, including
Oh, yeah.
people like Andrew Young, who said he would carry around a copy. So it kind of brings him into that. He had been working on this idea, a kind of idea through all his work in the 50s about God's relationship with man. And his argument really revolved around this idea of how humans could open themselves up to hear God, to hear God's anger and fury. And that was part of what piety was. And that was what part of actually practicing religion in an intense way could allow a person to do. And he talks about this idea of radical amazement, which is the subtitle for the book, which is the ability to really see the things we basically as humans have learned to ignore, can't appreciate.
Right.
And that's a process of getting closer to God. And the Hebrew prophets is really interesting in that he's writing about the people who could do that. And
right.
He's writing about these figures who yelled and screamed and were right. furious, and they were often called crazy, and they were often right. said to be, drunks, and they didn't know what they're, and he's taking them in a very different way, that they were actually aware of all the things in the world that people were morally indifferent about. And they were raging about social injustice and poverty and war when most people were living with it. And right. the book is quite powerful in connecting those two themes.
We could talk for another hour just about that book, but I love the moment in the 60s when he's asked and you quote it, what would the prophets say or do today in our circumstance? He said, they'd all be in jail.
Yeah. Right.
It's a great answer. Isaiah would be in jail. Right. And by far, Isaiah, it seems to be his most important prophet, but we probably don't have time to go into that. All right, civil rights in Vietnam, and the issue of Soviet Jews, and the issue of Jews' relationship to Catholicism, all of these big, four huge problems of the 1960s animate Heschel's life, animate his work, and in a sense, remake his life, don't they?
They do. And they're all happening at the same time. The civil rights is the one that I could start with. And it starts really, he's interested, he's following the civil rights struggles that are taking place in the early 60s. But his moment of connection really comes, in addition to writing this book, in 63, King invites him to speak at a conference on religion and race that he's organized in Chicago. And he's brought all kinds of religious leaders to speak about these themes. He invites Heschel, who is put into contact through mutual acquaintances. And Heschel gives this incredible, very powerful speech. I quote a lot of it in the book, where he basically argues if you say you're religious and you're racist, you're not religious, that religion can't coexist with race. And we have to remember, this is a time there's many preachers, not just in the South, but in the North, who are opposed to civil rights and who are using theology to justify racial inequality. He calls racism Satanism, and he says it's blasphemy. Cornel West would later say it's one of the strongest speeches by a white person about race that we've heard on the public stage. And after that, King and him become friends. They stay in contact, and Heschel becomes more involved in the movement. Primarily speaking, as a professor does, he'll speak at regional gatherings about religion and race, and it culminates in 65 in March, not the first March in Selma, but another one. The first one's called Bloody Sunday. This is the famous one where the police attack the marchers, including John Lewis. But a few weeks later, King asks religious leaders to come as a show of support for voting rights and for the voting rights bill. And Heschel's there, and Heschel marches right in front with King. And it's a spiritual moment for Heschel. And it also this is covered in all the papers. There's a picture of Heschel in all the major newspapers. It kind of puts him in a new place in terms of activism. But he sees the connection from what he was writing in the Hebrew prophets to what people like King were doing. He's fascinated. He sees in the Black church the kind of spirit he didn't find in the Jewish synagogue. And I think following that Selma march in 65, he could never not be an activist again, but he's very firmly on the side of the civil rights movement and believes himself to be part of it.
Oh, his writings about and his devotion to racial equality are just palpable. I mean, in his work, you can sometimes tell when it's superficial and when it's not. We can come back to that a bit, but then the war, Vietnam, by 65, 66, and 67, in these stages when the anti-war movement was still considered very radical. Right, it's by no means a consensus that the war was going wrong when Heschel gets engaged with it. But once Heschel got engaged fighting against the Vietnam War, it may have been the most compelling issue in his life. He just couldn't stop.
No, absolutely. I mean, before 65, as you said, civil rights is the big issue. He gets very involved. He's one of the first people, I'll get to the Vietnam in 10 seconds, who is starting to advocate for Soviet Jews, living in the Soviet Union. And he's really at the forefront of the movement to protect Soviet Jewry. Elie Wiesel becomes a friend and will credit Heschel with inspiring him to write one of the big books about this issue that gained attention before it was really a movement, as it would be in the 70s. He's involved in Vatican II, but then Vietnam is taking place. And in 65, he joins a group of interfaith leaders, including John Bennett at the Union Theological Seminary, William Sloane Coffin at Yale, group of progressive preachers who start to say, this war is not good. And they form this group, it's known as CalCav, of religious leaders, and they don't want to associate themselves with the most radical elements of the anti-war movement, which is very small still. So they're early, and they're trying to gain legitimacy for fighting this war. And it's a very important group. It will expand over the course of the 60s. One of the stories I tell in the book is that when Martin Luther King finally decides to speak out in a forceful way against the war, he does it at an event that Heschel and his colleagues organized at the Riverside Church. And Heschel's sitting right there next to him, if you watch the old videos, as King makes a historic speech where he blasts Vietnam, distances himself from Lyndon Johnson, which was controversial. And this group, and the group was also, they do mobilizations in Washington in 67, 68, 69. They bring preachers to Washington to meet with senators. They meet with Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense. They'll meet with Henry Kissinger. And he's consumed with this. Towards the end of his life,
that's an amazing scene, by the way. When they meet with McNamara. My brother has spent a piece of his life writing about Robert McNamara, so I've learned something about his character. But that scene where they're in McNamara's office, these ministers and rabbis, and McNamara's, impatient, and you should tell it.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean,
everyone's being polite essentially,
Right.
and here they are meeting with the Secretary of Defense. It's intimidating. They're in this,
Right.
huge, ornate room,
Yeah.
and Heschel can't contain himself, and he just lashes out in a
Right.
way that someone wrote a note who was there saying, like, no one could believe he was saying this. Like, how can you support this war? How are we doing this as a country? And the language Heschel was using by that point. In today, everyone would say just how radical he had become in many ways about the fundamental immorality, not just about U.S. soldiers, but also about the North Vietnamese, that this killing had to stop. McNamara, of course, being Robert McNamara, can contain himself and doesn't really respond. But it's an important for him, like the prophets, literally speaking to power, speaking to someone at the center of the war, and telling him exactly what he thought of what was going on.
I think somebody after that said Heschel suddenly sounded just like Isaiah. Well, that would have been a compliment for Heschel, I'm sure. Can you say a word about him going to Rome and meeting with the Pope, Paul VI, I think? That also was an incredibly sensitive issue in those years, and he took a lot of heat from that event too, didn't he? Especially from Orthodox Judaism.
He did. This was part of Vatican II, which goes on from 1962 to 65, the heart of this, where the Vatican is revisiting core doctrine related to other religious groups, including Jews. It's part of the Vatican wrestling with the post-World War II period as well. And through the American Jewish Committee, Heschel becomes an informal liaison where he's in constant negotiations and discussions with Vatican officials, with one cardinal in particular. And it's a difficult process. There's many moments where the Vatican basically backtracks on reforms that they promised to make. And it culminates with him, and this was all secret, no one knew about this at first, having a meeting with the Pope, which goes terribly. The communication is not good. A lot of people in the Vatican were angry with Heschel. They thought the words he was using, he was basically accusing them of anti-Semitism. But it will end in 65 with reforms that Heschel certainly feels he was part of, and many people still credit him with. But many American Jewish leaders were not happy. Orthodox Jewish leaders didn't believe it was proper to discuss theology with another religion. That was just not, and he disagreed with them and did it anyway. There were other American Jewish leaders who said kind of, why Heschel? Why is he the one who was involved in this when it becomes revealed in the press rather than other groups? But those kinds of things didn't dissuade him, which was interesting about him. He was so focused on the righteous cause, so to speak, that he could take that kind of criticism, as he did with Vietnam, and he would just move forward.
Well, I think they're going to make me move to questions here any moment. I don't want to stop because I want to just keep asking you about him. I mean, Heschel is only going to live to 1972. He had a lot of heart disease. But by the time his life came to an end, he had developed, a sort of legendary status, whether people loved him or didn't love him. And you deal with that as well toward the end of the book, about his symbol by then as the activist Jewish rabbi. Martin Luther King referred to him as my rabbi. But I have to say, Julian, my favorite moment, there are many favorite moments I have in this book, but my favorite moment, and I'd love to know how you found this, is the day on Shabbat when Martin Luther King and William Sloane Coffin just show up at Heschel's house up in the 400 block of Riverside Drive, and it's during rituals. I mean, and he gives one of them the spices and one of them something else, and they read the prayers, they finish the rituals.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story. This is the
It's an
end of the
incredible
Sabbath.
moment.
Yeah, it's the end of the Sabbath. They came at that time, and he basically has them participate.
Right.
And then afterwards, they talk and they drink, have some drinks, and they talk about philosophical issues and the issues of the day. It's an amazing moment, not only just that
And they
it
smoke
happened.
cigars that smoke those
Yeah.
Dutch masters too.
He smoked cigars all the time. Yeah, even in his archives, there were all kinds of wrappers from the cigars. It's an amazing moment to see how enmeshed he had become in these political movements. I found it. His archives are at Duke University, really amazing archives. But there were also papers at the Jewish Theological Seminary that other writers who have written about Heschel, two very good biographers, donated their papers. And so I was looking through this before COVID. It was one of those, I went pretty close. I found out about them, and they're not filed. So I had to go through all of this. And there's lots of interviews with people very close to him. And one told that story, which I just thought was remarkable. And it was another reminder that how important his Judaism was, meaning he wanted to bring them in as activists and friends, but he also engaged them in this core Jewish tradition ritual that he would do at the end of every Sabbath. And it totally captured that it wasn't he was Jewish and wrote about Judaism and he was an activist.
Yeah.
These two things were intricately connected. And I think that story, for me at least, captured how that worked for him.
Oh, I love that moment. It's just unforgettable. Anyone who reads this book, there are going to be several unforgettable moments. That's certainly one of them. We have a lot of questions here, Julian. Let me start. Where would you rank Heschel, if you can, in the pantheon of Jewish thinkers? I mean, ranking isn't what historians always like to do, except with presidents.
No, right. I was just thinking that. I don't know. See, the thing about Heschel, which is interesting, is that in Jewish intellectual circles, there's a lot of critics of him. There were and there still are, that he wasn't the kind of the greatest writer. He didn't write about Jewish law the way a guy named Saul Lieberman would. That said, his writing has, through this day, such an impact on people. It's incorporated into religious services in synagogues across the country in ways that few other thinkers are. That for me, I don't know how you rank him, but that matters. The writing style you talked about still has an ability to reach people long after his death, which makes him a very significant thinker. And then, going back to his writing about how do we think of spirituality and how in the modern era do we think not of institution questions, but of how do you attach people to faith in our age that we're all living through. I think they're incredibly powerful ideas and arguments that make him quite an important thinker in my mind.
Well, and he draws in non-Jews. I mean, I can't stop. I've now bought virtually every book of Heschel's, and I can't stop. So that's another measure. Another good, quick question here. Did he, any evidence he actually considered himself a prophet? Or is that a relevant question for him?
Yeah, I mean, people do ask that. And I didn't have the evidence he thought of himself as a prophet, though he was part of the prophetic tradition. I mean, I think he understood everything he wrote about the Hebrew prophets. I think he thought Martin Luther King was at some level a prophet. And by being in these movements, I don't know if he's walking around, I'm a Hebrew prophet now. But it was that tradition that he was very much engaged in. And that's ultimately what was important. He was a big thinker and he was very confident in himself, but he also could be incredibly humble about himself and about all humans in a way that might have checked how he thought of that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're reading Heschel, you can't help
whether he looked like a prophet.
Yeah, no, he looks like one too, but whether he had any self-consciousness of that, the way he writes about prophets is prophetic. I mean, to say the least. What about Heschel and the state of Israel? I mean, complicated story, I know, but where does that fit in his life?
It's important. So he was always a Zionist, even as a young person in Warsaw and in Berlin. He thought of Israel primarily just in relationship to the Jewish people historically. that it was pretty integral to what the people were. In 48, he's very happy and ecstatic about the foundation, the creation of the Jewish state.
Right.
I would say it doesn't define a lot of what he does, though, which is not anomalous for this period. He was really interested in the state of Judaism here in the United States and all over the world. Even after Israel's formation, he says the real question, are Jews worthy of Israel? And that's what he was paying his attention to. And he's interested in these human rights, global rights issues. It's not that Israel's unimportant. He visits it in the 50s. It's very expensive. He has a trip. He likes it very much, but it wasn't as defining as I think it's become, especially for politically active Jews in recent decades. In 67 is the most important moment where it really starts to shape some of what's going on. That's the Six-Day War. Yeah. Many of his colleagues in the anti-war movement are critical of Israel and territorial acquisition after the war. Heschel is very adamant and argued it was a defensive war. He saw this as an attack on Judaism, not just on Israel, that it was a threat to this state created in response to the Holocaust. And he writes a book basically explaining this idea. And it's he gets in real tense moments, but in the end, he goes right back into the anti-war movement. He works very well with all these people because it's the Vietnam issue is just the issue that matters to him most. So that's how Israel fit into how he was thinking.
This backs up in the chronology a bit, but it's interesting. Did Heschel ever write or reflect on the connection of the American Jim Crow system with the Nazi system or the Nuremberg laws? Did he ever take that up as a piece of history?
That's a really good question, and
might not have been a subject he would tackle.
I mean, the way what he did often say in his speaking too, he would compare Americans, Jewish, Christian, and others in the early 60s who were standing silently and being indifferent to not just the movement, but the response to the movement and all the measures that were preventing racial justice to the early 1940s and even the 1930s, where he said that's what happened with the rise of Nazi power and the silence of both American Jews, he would say, Christians all over the world. So he would make that comparison. I don't know if I encountered anything where he was writing about the Jim Crow laws in particular, making that comparison. But it might be in there, but I didn't see it.
Yeah, I wonder, there are a couple of questions. Well, there's a question here about his daughter, Susanna. Could you talk about her a bit? She became a theologian herself. In fact, I've had some correspondence with her recent times. What about his daughter and her work, and her work in actually continuing her father's work, because she's edited books of his essays. So
one thing that was back in his own life, the family unit was very tight. She's an only child, and they were very close. And I just found amazing kind of stories about the way they celebrated the Sabbath. He supported her getting a bat mitzvah at a time when most synagogues would not do that, including most conservative leaders. And he very much wanted her to do that. She becomes a very renowned scholar. She teaches at Dartmouth right now, and she writes really about feminism and religion, although she often is speaking about her dad. And I think it's very helpful, frankly, listening to her and watching her. And she's tried to keep his tradition and his legacy alive. We had a wonderful meal while I was writing this. I went up to Boston to meet her, and it was very helpful. He was a family man. He loved his wife very dearly. He really loved his daughter. That was clear from the letters I found between them. And
so he wasn't the genius father who was impossible to follow. She managed that pretty well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And many loving stories about what he was like as a father, playing peekaboo with her while growing up, or playing
Yeah.
checkers at night. And it was very important to him. He didn't have tons of friends in the Jewish Theological. He had one friend named Wolf Kelman, who was kind of the executive who ran the place, a rabbi also of Orthodox origins. He had a friend, Marshall Meyer, who was a student of his, who went to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and became a very big voice of conservative Judaism, and actually fought for human rights in Argentina for years after. Personal connection. My father was his assistant rabbi when he left rabbinical school in Buenos Aires. So an amazing connection, because this was one of Heschel's really kind of confidants. But the family, Susanna and his wife, I think really were a quite important foundation for him as he wrestled in very emotional ways with the trouble that he saw and the injustices that he was seeing all around him.
Well, you have moments toward the end of his life you describe where he just breaks down. It appears he just almost feels a broken man because the world is so broken. I mean, we got to remember, he dies in 1972. The Vietnam War is not over. The real legacies of the civil rights movement, we don't know yet. It's all unfinished when he comes to an end. And it's hard to know, but as a biographer, you are trying to penetrate that. And I wonder if you would reflect, as we kind of round it out here, on his kind, if you can, on his kind of piety. And I think what I mean by that is, you show this so beautifully. He could be mystical. He could be just deeply tied to the text. But he was always about faith that had to be inward. It was so important to him that to keep probing and probing and probing one's own faith. I mean, you have that wonderful story. I don't know if he's walking on Riverside Drive with students or colleagues or something, and he will just stop sometimes and say, "Now look, don't forget the trees, don't forget the rivers, don't forget, the world around you." There was a mystic in him, but he reached for a kind of piety that is very hard for most people. And I wonder if you'd reflect on that a bit, because that to me comes through in all of Heschel's writing.
I agree. It's a remarkable part of who he was. He was not only just wrestling with these questions at an intellectual level, but he really wanted to figure this out, or he wanted to continue to engage in a debate with himself as much as anyone else about what does it mean to be a pious person in this world, and what does it mean to think of your relationship with God, and how to understand that at a very deep level. And it manifested itself in this, through all of his writing. He never stops with this question. And if you read him, there's an emotion behind his writing, which as a reader, you see he's serious about this. He wants to really think about this. It's not just, here's another book. He's trying to understand this. You see it in his activism. I mean, when he's marching in Selma, he says he was thinking it was like back in Warsaw, where he was marching with Hasidic rabbis down the streets. He felt like his legs were praying, and it was a spiritual moment for him. And that's how he understood this like huge march. It went right to that same question. He really felt it and sensed it. And then just in the kind of care he had for these questions, whether it was walking down the street and telling students or friends, look at the trees, look at the water, don't forget the amazing parts of the world that suggest or show there is something beyond this. Ultimately, he believed that piety and being pious would allow us as humans to get beyond our ego, to get beyond the self. And that's when you start to get in this very special place. And to see a person who spent his entire life right through his death with the ups and downs wrestling with this it's quite inspiring. And it's quite powerful as a thinker to find someone like that.
Well, and Heschel certainly found a biographer in you. I have to say, for everyone who hasn't bought this book yet, and I'm serious, Julian had to fit into a series at Yale Press, which didn't allow him to write a 450-page book. They like these to be a bit shorter. And I could even sense the moments when I just know you were going to go on more on that or quote more. But you controlled this story in a way that you just couldn't wait for the next chapter. What's going to happen next? There are unforgettable passages in here, both your writing and his. I'll never forget the passage now. It might have been that first conference that King invites him to, where he says, the first civil rights conference was probably Moses and Pharaoh, and you know what? It's never ended.
Right.
That must have had all those Baptists just rolling on the floor, But then the people who wrote about him too, his students and others, about how they felt like, whether they agreed with him or not, they were in the presence of somebody holy, a word we don't use much anymore, or at least I don't hear it much. And he wasn't afraid of that word at all. Take it out, Julian, a holy man here who lived in the world and tried to act to remake the world, which is probably why he was in some despair at the end.
I mean, I'll look, I think what you're saying is, here is someone who is comfortable caring about what it meant to live in a holy way and to speak and wrestle with issues which in many of his circles, were not the kinds of questions people were asking, because he was also not scared of the world around him. And that went back from his childhood, but certainly by the time he was in New York, he wasn't just living in both worlds, he was totally absorbed by both of them, and happy to find these connections and keep coming back to these questions, which were not always popular. They were not always what you would do if you were, at a dinner party in New York City, but he was insistent. And he couldn't separate those concerns with the horrible things that were going all around him, which could lead him to be despondent toward the end of his life. But even in his very final interview that played after he died with a reporter named Carl Stern on NBC, broadcast. And Stern is saying, how can you still believe in all this? Your friend Martin Luther King was assassinated, the war in Vietnam. And he says, I remain an optimist, sometimes despite, my best inclinations. And he said, ultimately, he believed in the progressive direction of the world, even though there were ups and downs. And that was Heschel. And that's how so many people today, I think, look to him for inspiration. The cover of the book, was a great photo. The press found it, but it's that's
a great photo.
The image conveys exactly what you're saying in many ways.
You see that photo, and my first thought seeing that photo was, I want to listen to this guy. I want to hear him. I might be intimidated, but I want to hear it. Well, Julian, this has been an honor for me, a real thrill to have this chance to talk about this book with you. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And I urge everybody out there to get it. It's a great read. And thanks for doing this, and thanks for inviting me. And we're going to close it out then. I want to thank the Leon Levy Center and its foundation for this event, and to Shelby White, the benefactor. And thank you all for coming tonight. We had a great audience, and the Levy Center will welcome you back next week at their next event. Thanks, Julian, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you for a great interview, David. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.